Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great so far this year. From this episode on, I'm gonna introduce you to a new poet whose name is Tao Yuanming. And the first poem that I'm gonna introduce you to is called Drinking Wine. And this is actually a series of poems in total of 25, but I'm gonna pick one of my favorite for today and to give you a little bit of background introduction of this poet. And Tao Yuanming has been my favorite poet since I was 13 years old, and he has always been my favorite. He's the most famous hermit in Chinese history, and I hope you like his poem as much as I do. Drinking wine. In people's haunt I build my cot, of wheels and hoofs noise I hear not. How can it leave on me no trace? Secluded heart makes secluded place. I pick fence-side asters at will. Carefree, I see the southern hill. The mountain air is fresh day and night. Together, birds go home in flight. What revelation at this view? Words fail if I try to tell you. Now the original Chinese text. 饮酒，结庐在人境，而无车马喧。问君何能尔？心远地自偏。采菊东篱下，悠然见南山。山气日夕佳，飞鸟相与还。此中有真意，欲辨已忘言。Let's begin with a bit of background introduction.The Tao Yuanming, the poet, lived from 365 to 427 AD. He is one of the best-known poets during the Six Dynasties period. Now, the reason why that era was called the Six Dynasties is because due to political conflicts, wars, coup d'etat, and invasion of the northern nomads and many other reasons, dynasties at that time normally don't last for over 10 years. It was one of the darkest times in Chinese history, and this is why Tao Yuanming, our poet here, chose not to cooperate with the government and become a farmer. Often we refer Tao Yuanming as a hermit, but in fact, the word hermit in Chinese, which is 隐士, has a little bit different meaning from the word hermit in English. In the Chinese context, being a hermit does not mean you necessarily need to hide away from the crowd. It only refers to people who used to be public figures, or government officials, or people who are famous, choose to become anonymous, usually by going back home for farming.And Tao Yuanming did just that when he realized that working with the government and to make a living out of it by exploiting the public was not what he wanted. Becoming a farmer and finding the peace in his heart by living a quiet and idyllic life was something he would rather do. Tao Yuanming was actually made famous by Su Shi, and this happened almost 1,000 years after his death.Su Shi declared Tao Yuanming a paragon of authenticity in poetry, and that's how Tao Yuanming would achieve lasting fame. Because Tao's poems usually depict the beautiful and soothing nature sceneries, he's often regarded as the foremost representative of what we now know as fields and gardens poetry.Since Buddhism just started to be prevalent in China back then, when Tao Yuanming was alive, Taoism is believed to have a lot of influence on Tao Yuanming and we could see this sense of finding truth in nature in this poem and in later poems that I'm going to introduce to you. So coming back to this poem, the first two sentences, in people's haunt I build my cot, of wheels and hoofs noise I hear not.How can it leave on me no trace? Secluded heart makes secluded place. Aren't they just speaking the truth? And when I read this poem at the age of 13, I could understand the meaning of it, but in fact, after I started to work, these sentences resonates with me much stronger than before. In Chinese, we often say the greater hermit lives in seclusion in the city, 大隐隐于市 To be able to maintain your individual beliefs and integrity in a not favorable environment is much more valuable than doing so in a faraway place away from the crowd. Or you can also understand it as suggesting that being away from the crowd doesn't mean naturally you're a hermit. It's all about your way of thinking, your ideas, and your choices. He goes on to depict the natural scenery of the southern hill and the birds returning to their nests at sunset. In front of this spectacular view, he concludes with another punchline that almost every Chinese knows so well. What revolution at this view, words fail if I try to tell you. Now, Taoism emphasizes that the greatest Tao, or the way, cannot be told, and indeed, there is a limitation to every existing language. Languages only reflect what can be perceived by human beings through their five senses, but we all know that the world or the universe is much, much bigger than this. So even for the most common sensation that we receive from nature, we could use words like beautiful, marvelous, breathtaking to describe them, but they still fall short to capture what we feel from the nature and, of course, those truths that are beyond our feelings, that lies with the scenery and we cannot perceive as human beings. So in fact, every line in this poem shocks me every time when I read it. I'd be very glad to hear what you think of this poem and the messages that it conveys. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.